And I know that Anthony, from that, I suppose it may have been that also meant that he ended up writing a great wealth of poetry, but also some haiku, which is, I think, a Japanese sort of, particularly
Yes.
Japanese way into poetry.
Well, we've been back to Japan many, many times. We were both taught in Japan in those first 2 years there, 1955 to 57. And our first child was born there. And we had made many friends among our students who are still, in fact, one of them is now my translator. So she'll come into the story perhaps a little later on. But it was an extraordinary time. And we worked out that we've been to Japan. I've been 11 times and Anthony's been 13 times, something like that, always at the expense of the Japanese after that, because the British Council took us there in the first place. But we've been extraordinarily lucky, and Japan is only one of many, many places that I've been invited to in the course of my long, long life.
Well, perhaps when things are a bit more normal across the world, we'll have our chance as a couple to go and spend our first time in Japan. But now you live in, as they would say, deepest Norfolk. And one of the interesting things, of course, about your time there is that you ran for a long while a children's library at the same time as writing children's books, I think.
That's true. We came to Norfolk in, well, it's almost exactly 50 years ago. And we've lived in the same house here on the Taz in South Norfolk. And I started the library for the children roundabout because we had so many children's books. I was reviewing children's books, mainly for the TLS in those days. And I had all these books, and there was no library nearer than Norwich at the time. And Norwich is 9 miles away and not somewhere you just call into after school. So we had the library every Monday afternoon between 3 and 6. And children came over the 20 years, 1973 to 1993, I did. And it was lovely for me. And of course, it made us very integrated into the community. And there are still people who come up and address me, and well, there were before lockdown in supermarkets and so on, saying, "Oh, it means many other things apart from the library, of course."
That's marvelous.
Where do we go from there?
Well, I think where we go from there is one of the things, as I said right at the beginning, that you're most well known for, really, is biography. What was it, I wonder, initially? Who or what took you into biography at the beginning?
Well, it's not terribly, it's not a story I'm really very proud of, but I will be honest. We were always being invited to parties, literary parties, and when we could get babysitters, of course. And I used to be asked, what do I do? What am I writing? Or who am I? And so on. And I used to, when I mentioned children's books, everyone was not particularly interested. And after a while, I thought it's about time, although I still believe, and I really do believe, that children's books are much more important than adult books. In other words, it matters much more what we read when we're young than what we read later on. However, even though, well, anyway, I decided I wanted to write a book that adults would read and possibly even talk about and review in the papers and so on. And I looked for one reason was that I didn't believe that I could write a novel that I would want to read. Whereas I thought if I found someone really interesting, I would be able to write a good book about someone else. That's slightly weird, really, but that was how it started. And there was a woman in Richmond. We lived in Richmond in southwest London at that time. And there was a woman called Janet Dunbar. And some of you may remember, she wrote a rather good biography of J.M. Barrie. And she lived down the road. And I went to see her when I decided to write about Frances Hodgson Burnett. The point about Frances Hodgson Burnett, and I explained this in the introduction to Beyond the Secret Garden. I have to hold that up. Is it upside down or I'm looking at a mirror? It looks a mirror.
No, that's right.
Oh, you can see it properly. Isn't that funny? When I look, it's in mirror writing. Anyway, that's the new book. But when I decided on Frances Hodgson Burnett, it was mainly really triggered by something that John Rowe Townsend said in Written for Children, his book about children's literature, and something that Margarita Lasky said in a book that she wrote about Mrs. Molesworth, and were 3 Victorian novelists. And they both made me curious about her. And I wondered why there wasn't a contemporary biography, I suppose, of her. And I remember when the book was finally published in 1974, Elizabeth Jane Howard in her review said, I had to be congratulated on having found someone so interesting and so neglected to write about. Well, I didn't feel that was the main reason for choosing her, but it was true that nobody seemed to know anything very much about her. I thought, from what, I mean, Margarita Lasky had said some rather derogatory remarks about her from what she'd read. And she'd only read Vivian Burnett's biography, which is rather strange, really, the biography offered by her son. And the book was never published. That book was never published in England. But Margarita Lasky had read it and said she sounded offensively whimsical and various things that I thought could not be possible of the author of The Secret Garden. Because, of course, it was The Secret Garden that made me really want to find out more about Frances Hodgson Burnett. And it's rather strange because one of the reasons I just can go on wittering on, you can ask me another question in a minute, but that leads to the fact that this book has been published after all these years. It's 50 years since I did the research, and it's lovely to have it in print again. And the reason for that is that there is a new film of The Secret Garden. Everyone is interested in The Secret Garden. Everyone seems to know The Secret Garden. In fact, some people were very cross that I called the title of the first edition of my book, Waiting for the Party, and made me, and a later publisher decided that was a great mistake and I should rename it. But the book is basically the same book I wrote all those years ago, but this time with an absolutely wonderful 8-page introduction by Jacqueline Wilson, the very, very popular children's writer whose books sell, where my books might sell in a few thousands, hers sell in millions, I think, all over the world. But I don't think you'd even heard of her, Stephen, had you?
I have heard of her, and my wife has certainly heard of her. And I think probably men less than women, I'm generalizing, men less than women tend to
it's children. She writes
books.
Children's books.
Exactly. Whereas I think women probably read them more because they're thinking what their children might want to read. But let me it will come back with plenty of space to talk more about The Secret Garden a bit later on, rather in sonata form, if you like, because we've started with that. So that was your first biography, was it?
Yes.
Yeah. But you've written so many other good books. I'd like to mention them. I know that frustratingly not all of them are in print, but nowadays people know how to get them, even if they're not in print. You can get them on I better not advertise the names of
well, no, but the point about getting books that are out of print, I mean, I know all writers want readers, that's absolutely true. But of course, you don't get any money if you're buying a second or a book that's just been recycled in some sense. I don't know where they get them from. In fact, actually, one of my books, and you mentioned in my New Zealand connection, I was at school there during the war. My mother took her out and then came back to be with my father in London. But we didn't see our parents for long years, 5 years nearly. And anyway, I just discovered that Passageways, a book that is totally out of print, which is the story of my ancestors, my family history, and it gets me up to the age of 12, that can be obtained from something called Scribd, Scribd, perhaps it's called SCRIBD, and it takes 8 hours, it's online, and you can listen to it. Or well, I don't know, you must be listening to it because it says 8 hours. I didn't know, I only looked it up this morning. I had no idea that you could listen to my family history for 8 hours.
Well, I know exactly what you mean about yes, not you don't actually receive any reward for out of print books. One of the earliest books I did, I decided, because it was quite useful for a chap going to cathedrals, I thought I'd buy him a copy, and I bought a copy for about £10, which was slightly more than it cost in the first place. And the next one on this particular second-hand book system was £187, 32 pence for some peculiar reason. But let's move on. Let's move on. Yes, I mean, I think perhaps the first book I remember reading of yours was the biography of Edmund Goss. And then soon after that, I read Philip Henry Goss, that's his father's biography, with that splendid title, Glimpses of the Wonderful, and those wonderful end pages. So did Edmund Goss come next after The Secret Garden?
Yes, it did. And it took me 10 years, and because I had children at home and many, many distractions. And I was also editing a children's annual called All Sorts in those years. So it took me a long, long time. It was published exactly 10 years after Francis Hodgson Burnett. And it is a literary landscape. The really interesting thing about Edmund Goss, not only that he's the author of Father and Son, which is one of the great memoirs of a childhood, but that he knew so many people whom we're still interested in: Henry James, Robert Louis Stevenson, you name it. I think everyone's forgotten about Swinburne, but Swinburne was one of the major characters as well. Lots and lots of them. By the way, The Glimpses of the Wonderful, the title of my biography of his father, which gave a rather different picture of his childhood, is the title of one of Philip Henry's own books. It comes, and the title page of that is in the front of the book. And one of the sad things about that book, not only is it out of print, but it was never in paperback. It's the most beautiful hardback. In fact, some people might be interested in the story, sort of thinking about money. It was published at, £20 or £25 or something. And that's a lot of money, or certainly was. And when did it come out? I know, it came out on my 70th birthday, 2002. It didn't sell particularly well. It had marvelous reviews, wonderful reviews. I couldn't have wished for anything better, but it was expensive and it was very beautiful. And when it wasn't, after a while, Faber decided to remainder a certain number of copies. And I saw it in Waterstones in Norwich for £10. And I bought a couple because I have to pay more than that if I get it directly from the publisher. The rate I hadn't been told it was being removed. Anyway, the point was they had a huge stack of them. These £10 Glimpses of the Wonderful. And by the end, I went back to, I decided I'd get another one or two, and they'd all gone. So the book was, people wanted to read the book, wanted to own the book. It's a beautiful book, but they were not prepared to pay £25 for it.
Pay that price. One of the fascinating things I think about that book, and this may come up again when we come back to The Secret Garden, was, as you said, it gave a rather different picture of Edmund Goss's childhood. And the great story I remember, which shows some of the research that you yourself did, is the story about the Christmas pudding being thrown in the grate, which is a very different tale in your book to that which we find in Edmund Goss.
Absolutely. I couldn't tell you about it now. I think I don't remember it clearly enough, but I know that there were many, many things that Edmund, he got wrong. I mean, Edmund Goss was a marvelous writer, and it's a wonderful book, but he had a genius for inaccuracy, as Henry James says. That's a phrase from Henry James of Goss. And I tell you quite an interesting biographical story about this, that and I'd mentioned Swinburne briefly, although I know he's not much read today. Goss was in the British Museum. He was working in the library of the British Museum when Swinburne fell. It was his first sight of Swinburne. It was very dramatic. He'd fallen on one of the, in those days, the British Museum, British Library desks had metal stanchions, or I think stanchions is the word, at the side. And he had cut his head on them and was being carried out. He had very bright hair and he had blood streaming from his forehead. And this was Edmund Goss's first view of Swinburne. And he wrote the story himself at one point. And then I was able to read what he had written on the day it happened to his father, because he wrote dutifully many, many long, long letters. It was a sort of diary, in fact, which he wrote to his father, not mentioned, of course, in Father and Son. And everything was different. Absolutely everything was totally different from the way that he described it, the time of day, everything. And so this is something that you see, Edmund wouldn't have had any access to his own letter, which I read. He hadn't in front of him when he wrote that passage.
No, one of the things I think that comes out of your book, and I'll move us on then, but is the fact that his relationship with his father, in fact, was in many ways very, very loving and very good, which is not the picture you get from father and son. But let's move us on, because before we're getting, I want to move us up to date in a moment, but on the way, of course, one of the really key characters for young children that you wrote a marvelous biography was A.A. Milne, and you also then wrote Goodbye, Christopher Robin, which was the book on which the, I think, very good film of Milne was based. Perhaps you might just say a little bit about that whole experience.
Yes, well, it was a very exciting experience for me. I mean, it transformed my life in many ways. I had no idea what went on when films were being made. It took a long, long time. I read about 5 different versions of the script before there was one that we could agree to. It was only when Frank Cottrell Boyce came on the scene that we finally got the script that we wanted. And I was very involved, and they were wonderful. I mean, I was made to feel very much part of the team producing the film, as I was simply a consultant. But I went to the filming. And in fact, they even let my grandson, one of my grandsons, who was about 16 at the time, was able to be an extra in the scene of the pageant, and we had a marvelous time with the film. I know films, it would be very tedious to be always involved. I sat next on the platform in the pageant scene in Goodbye, Christopher Robin, with a man who was purported in the film to be my husband, I suppose, and he wanted to put his arm through mine and so on. But he had been an extra for, I think, 40 years or something. You see, they had to have someone fairly elderly to match me. And can you imagine all the hanging around what that would involve? Being an extra must be really difficult. And yet, for me, just to glide in and have a couple of days watching both at Poostick's Bridge, that was fascinating because we had to wait when they got permission to film on the real Poostick's Bridge, but they had to wait every time someone wanted to go across. And of course, Ashdown Forest is a very popular tourist spot, and so filming was interrupted by mothers and children coming to cross Poostick's Bridge. It was great fun for me. It was wonderful. And I was so relieved that it got made, because so many people told me, oh, it'll never happen, you know, as I went through all these deficient, I don't quite know how to describe them, but scripts that certainly wouldn't have worked until we got the right one.
And that the talk of the film, of course, brings us up to date and brings us to the fact that, if I can put it in the right place, there's my copy of Beyond the Secret Garden. And that, of course, is just about to be, the film is about to be launched. The new
yes,
film.
Of course, it's not a film about Frances Hodgson Burnett, it's the film of the Secret Garden itself.
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. But what I was going to say is to go back now and ask you, why exactly then did you choose for your first biography Frances Hodgson Burnett?
Well, it's very interesting, because I did say something about
you did earlier on, yes,
that she hadn't been properly treated in any way. I was very lucky to find her because she had a very, very interesting life, and was a remarkable woman, totally ahead of her time. Didn't spent ages, well, and the other thing that was particularly interesting about her, of course, was the fact that she was neither American nor English. Lots of Americans think she's American, and most English people think she's English. And she belonged to both countries. She went to America when she was only 15, after at the end of the American Civil War, which was actually not a good time to arrive. And they went because her father died, and her uncle, who was living in Tennessee, running a grocery, invited them to come and thought there would be a new opportunity for them in the new world. But it was very hard at first, and they really were in extreme poverty. And in fact, Frances had already experienced a good deal of hardship in Manchester after her father's death. She was born in Manchester, 1849. But then she had this wonderful gift for telling stories, and she was started trying to send her stories to the magazines. She said, my object is remuneration, which is quite often what gets writers going. Something that they have dreams of being, J.K. Rowling or indeed Jacqueline Wilson, but not that I've ever thought in those terms. But anyway, she did. She was a great writer, a great hard-working, extremely successful writer right from the beginning. Her stories sold. She went by herself as a young woman back to England to visit her cousins and friends in Manchester, and was in no hurry at all to get married. But she did finally, after in about 7 years, get married to Swan Burnett. It was not a good choice. In fact, she was terribly bad at choosing husbands. She had two husbands who were both, well, the second one hardly bears thinking about, but worth reading about, certainly. But she was someone who was determined to have an independent life, a life where she herself was earning her living. And she actually supported Swan, her husband. Why was he called Swan? I can't remember. Because he wanted to be an eye specialist. He was a doctor in Nashville, Tennessee. And he wanted to be, why did I say Nashville? Knoxville. We lived in Nashville much later. When Anthony was a poet in residence in Nashville. Anyway, she lived in Knoxville, and he wanted to become an eye specialist, and they went to Paris, which was a place that he felt that he could get his further degrees and satisfactions, and be able to be a very distinguished eye surgeon. And she supported them by writing stories, even though she had a small child at the time, and indeed become pregnant with her second son while they were there. And she was writing her first novel, sending stories back. She had a contract from her publisher in America, and she had to write, was it 3 stories a month? And it can't have been 2 stories a month. A lot of stories, and to keep them going, that was their sole income, was from her writing. And she was extraordinary. And then, as I say, she wrote the novel at the same time, and produced the second child. And then she came back, and they were in America, settled down for quite a long time. I think it must have been about 10 years before, and she was writing all the time, publishing lots of books, and indeed became mentioned in the 1880s as one of the top novelists for adults, this was, in America, along with Henry James and 1 or 2 others who are not remembered. Then she wrote Little Lord Fauntleroy, and that changed her life completely. I often think that if she'd not written that and gone on writing adult novels, she might well be remembered in the way that Mrs. Gaskell is a very distinguished novelist. adult novels now are hardly remembered at all, though two of them are in print from Persephone. They have the Shuttle, one of her late ones, and The Making of a Marchioness. But mainly she's known now only for The Secret Garden and A Little Princess, I would say, are the two books of hers that still keep her alive. So that's a quick run, But I was a fledgling feminist at that point, you see. I mean, this was in the 60s when I was doing my research. And she was a huge role model for anyone who wanted to earn their own living, live their own lives. I mean, I was in a very difficult situation because I happened to have chosen a good husband, unlike her. But she was a good model. There's no doubt about it.
Now, there's so much there, and I know that people will be wanting to ask you questions, and they could do that on the chat line. And afterwards, as many as we can have time for, I'll ask.
I have no idea what time is now.
No, we're doing fine. We're doing fine.
We're halfway through.
Another 10 minutes, I think. But as you said, Margarita Lasky said some rather unpleasant things about Frances Hodgson Burnett. But in that very good introduction by Jacqueline Wilson to your new edition of the biography, Jacqueline says that you have produced such a balanced biography in relation to how often biographers are. There's a great tendency now to want to go and dig around the most unpleasant bits of people's lives, little relating to much else, so that you get a bit of scandal, as it were. But
yes,
clearly, Jacqueline. So, say a bit more about that. There is
plenty of scandal. There's plenty of scandal.
Yes, there is.
But no, the word that Jacqueline used, which I was pleased about, was she used the word entertaining. I think this is what one wants to do. You know, research is marvelous, and that's what makes a biographer's life so interesting, the chance to go and follow in the footsteps of lots of different people. We haven't mentioned Emily Tennyson, and she gave me some of the most interesting travel of my career, because I had a Churchill Fellowship, and I followed in her footsteps as they went, as she and Tennyson traveled. But I had a particular interest as a poet's wife, of course, in her. But no, I'm losing my thread. What was I saying?
Well, you were just taking us into Frances Hodgson Burnett herself. I think when you were talking about it being an exciting and an interesting biography, as Jackie Wilson had said.
Well, yes, that's right. I like the fact that it's a bit long. People seem to prefer shorter books nowadays, and I've been cutting it a bit for Japan. My translator, I think I mentioned her earlier, we knew from the beginning. She wrote the translation, did the translation of Goodbye Christopher Robin, and the publisher said to her, what do you want to do next? She's obviously a very good translator, and he asked her. And she said, well, I've always wanted to do Anne Thwaite's biography of Frances Hodgson Burnett, but the trouble is it was a bit long, so I had to cut it for Japan, and it was after I'd cut it and spent a lot of time working on it for the Japanese translation that my agent tried to find said she was determined to find an English publisher for it, and that's how Beyond the Secret Garden and Duckworth have been rather marvelous. They've produced a really attractive looking book, and I'm terribly pleased to have it back in print again after all these years. And
now, what I was going to ask you is that quite late on in your biography, you talk about the Secret Garden, and you say the Secret Garden is clearly a book of a new century. And I'd be interested to hear a bit more about what you meant by that, and also, was that reflecting the fact that, in an odd way, Frances Hodgson Burnett was a woman looking to the new century?
Yes, even though she was born in 1849.
Exactly.
The same year as Edmund Goss, incidentally. That was rather nice for me, because I really got to know that period. The whole of the second half of the 19th century is very familiar to me. But Yes, what were you saying? Oh dear.
Oh, I was
sorry,
saying
Stephen.
no, not a bit. You were saying in your book that the Secret Garden was a book of the new century.
Yes, and the secret, it is very unusual. I mean, Jacqueline Wilson herself puts it very well, the way that when she bought her first puffin of the Secret Garden, she was so delighted or surprised to see the picture on the cover of that puffin, but it has had many different covers. The Secret Garden has been printed over and over and over again, of course, and the cover shows a disagreeable child, and the first sentence of the book, of course, also uses the word disagreeable. And to Jacqueline Wilson, she'd never read a book that addressed this, and certainly Victorian children who were, well, I don't know. I'm a better writer than a speaker, and I'm really not. I think I just have to say to people, buy the book, and you'll find in my introduction and in Jacqueline Wilson's introduction a great many things that are better said than anything I'm saying now.
And you're a brilliant speaker, and you are. I mean, you're animated, and we've already heard so much about so many different people. And I'm going to come back to Emily Tennyson before we finish. But in terms of the present biography or the revised biography, what would you hope? I mean, apart from the fact you would hope that people buy the book for very obvious reasons. What also would you hope that it might do for people in terms of Burnet and in terms of the Secret Garden and so on?
Well, it's quite interesting. I didn't really want to talk about the film, but the film, when I've got a big piece coming out in the New Statesman next week, the week the film comes into the cinema, and in that I said, what I really hope the film will do will not only send people, obviously I hope they will send people to find out about Frances Hodgson Burnett, but also that get people reading The Secret Garden again. I'm not even sure that many children read it now. I don't know. How does one find out? A lot of parents, grandparents and parents obviously buy it for the children, and the children probably are looking at their iPhones or whatever.
Oh no!
How can we find out? How can we encourage children to read The Secret Garden? I don't think. That's what I hope the film might do, even though the film is so totally different from the book. It can't be. It's made by the same people who made the Paddington films and indeed the Harry Potter ones. A famed team apparently, and very keen on CGI. Computer generation images or something.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I don't know. I just love them to turn from, if they see the film, to try the book, and that last sentence just might get them going. Mary Lennox, most disagreeable looking child I've ever seen. It is one of the interesting things about The Secret Garden was that it didn't make nearly as much mark when it came out. I mean, no one would realize at the time that it was going to be the book of hers that would be most remembered. It wasn't even mentioned in the obituary of her in the Times, even though afterwards Times readers wrote in and said what a delightful book it was, and that was the one book that would be remembered, even though it hadn't been mentioned. There were people who were obviously very keen on it, and it is remarkable. I mean, obviously, I hope that's one of the main things that will come out of the new edition.
Well, I'm sure that you asked how we get children to be introduced to it. I mean, I think the hour we're spending together now would be a good starter. I think that encouraging people to read your book, and of course, in a month or so's time, the new film will come out, which I'm sure will spark off many.
It's next week. It's next week, Stephen.
Next week, is it?
Yes.
And I should say to people as well that on the Duckworth website, there's a rather good quiz that people can engage with.
Oh, yes, thank you very much.
And also there are some questions which have been worked out for book clubs to use, which I think
I worked them out. Yes, I read them.
Did you?
Yes, and discussed them with daughters who belong to book perhaps too. I do hope there are people who, biographies are not often chosen for book groups because they're too long or something, but there's certainly so much that one can discuss and talk about, and not just chat. The biography does raise some really important questions, things that are worth talking about, and I hope that might be. The quiz has some excellent prizes. I made up this quiz because one of the things I want is to find good homes for I've got a huge collection of early Frances Hodgson Burnett novels, half a bookcase full. And I would love to give as prizes to anyone who does. You don't even have to answer every question correctly, but all the answers were in the book anyway. So you should be able to. And the closing date for that is November the 25th. And it is
indeed,
on the website.
That's right. It's on the website. Well, we're probably going to have to end this part of the conversation, but there's plenty of time. But just to say that I too must now go and buy also your, or get a copy secondhand of Emily Tennyson. I'm a huge fan of Tennyson and lived in Lincolnshire. And so that's another place where I must be looking too.
Yeah, good.
So, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and, if I can, master the electronics. We've got a nice series of questions, which will keep us going, I think, for quite a while. I think I'm going to ask, first of all, the question that I know has come from Christiane Bucknell, who I think is in Brisbane, as I said. And she says, can I ask Anne if there's any truth to the story Frances was made to burn her early works by her mother before she moved to Tennessee?
Goodness.
Have you heard that story?
Is it in my book? I don't think so. How has she heard? How is our Australian?
Well, that I don't know.
Heard that story. I don't. No, I certainly don't think. Her early work, no, because some of it survives. There are several things in the biography that poems that she wrote. Well, I think perhaps in the original one had 2 long poems that she wrote as a child. She might have burnt. I don't know where that story came from. I'm sorry, I really don't. I don't think it's true, actually.
Well,
why would anyone say that? I don't know.
But let me come on to a second question from someone else, and this rather links in with the fact that that a film is being made of The Secret Garden, and also, of course, there was the book about the film about Christopher Robin. And this person is asking, have you ever fancied writing a screenplay?
Oh, no, I suppose is a simple answer, but that's too boring. I haven't. It is a very specialized. You'd have to have extremely good knowledge of the whole film industry, I think, to write a good screenplay. You have to train yourself. It's a totally different thing. I was fascinated to watch the film being made, and as I said, and the producer, the director, let me sit beside one of the monitors so I could see what was actually being filmed at any one time, and as well as seeing the actual scene. And I mean, it is a most extraordinary and wonderful thing, making a film. But no, I haven't ever thought of writing a screenplay. Next question.
Well, the next question is also a sort of technical question to you as a biographer. Jackie Keynes-Lang is asking, on average, how long does it take you to move from researching your books to writing them?
Yes, I think I work very differently. That's an interesting question. Thank you. I do all the research first. I don't write anything until I've done all the research that I possibly can and which I think is necessary, which may take 4 or 5 years, of course, even longer, as I said, with Goss, when I was constantly being distracted by other things. But I then, after years and years, I stop and say, this is the moment to start writing. It's really always a very difficult to get that first sentence down. But when I've got all the material, and I think one of the things that Jackie knows and I is very unusual, and probably no one will ever do it again. I write everything by hand. I've only come to technology in about the last 8 years, but I can't imagine how one possibly write a book on a screen. I deliberately didn't learn to type. I think this is quite interesting, actually. People in my generation who learned to type, and many of my friends, fellow Oxford graduates, learned to type and then found themselves being secretaries to people and being in subordinate roles as secretaries, typing other people's stuff. By not learning to type, I handicapped myself for the contemporary world, but not because I still find writing, I only do it with one finger on the iPad. But anyway, I write by hand and I sit down for probably only 5 or 6 months and didn't do anything else for that time. I have one quite nice story that I like to tell. One of my, because I to try and show how totally absorbed I am. This was when I was doing the index for, I think it was Emily Tennyson. And I was having to do it while some of the family were visiting, which I normally would never do work, but an index, you have to wait until it comes at the last moment after the book is in print, after the pages are in typeset, of course. And I make my own indexes. And one of my granddaughters was obviously feeling very annoyed that I was away from the family and stuck in a room working. And but she was very good, and she came and did her jigsaw puzzle. She was about 5, outside my door, and I could just hear her. And I thought, well, she deserved a little congratulation on being so quiet and good and not interrupting me. And so I came, I just opened the door and said, oh, thank you, Maisie, for being so quiet. And then I went back to my work, and 5 or 10 minutes later, she was too small to write it herself. She was dictating it to her mother, but she had actually written it down, but the letters were dictated. She came back and said, nice to see you, Gran, pushed it under the door, this thing, which rather gives you the feeling of how, you just have to be, and you have to be isolated and get on with things. And of course, I could never do it. I'd never have done it if Anthony hadn't been such a domesticated husband. And poets, of course, write things that are rather short compared with biography. and so he was much more freed, especially in later years when he was no longer editing in London and so on. He was a wonderful support and often did all the shopping and cooking while I was the 5 months or so where I was, and we were not entertaining or doing anything during those times except unplanned. I mean, I never knew when an index would have to be written. You see, it just suddenly comes, and such a huge task to write an index. The whole thing is very hard work.
And when you were doing the research, I mean, how did you rotate? Did you use an index card system, or how did you?
Yes, you see, yes. That's the old fashioned. This is what I learned from Janet Dunbar in Richmond when she was instructing me on her system, and I used it all my life. Lots of index cards for every person who's mentioned, and for general subjects like might be music, gardens, servants, cats, all those sort of things. They all had their own index cards, and lots and lots of cross referencing and so on. And then date pages, files were for photocopies of letters and for notes on what was actually happening. Each year would have, some years might only have 1 or 2 if there's not much information on them. Other years might have 10 pages or more. And then you get sitting down to write. I would absorb all the material for one particular chapter, one particular period, and be able to refer to the theme cards at the same time. Now, I don't know how you do that on a computer. I just can't imagine. Can't think how biographies work.
Yes, it's interesting you say that, because in the books I've been responsible for, which are not quite in the same realm of numbers of readers as yours are, but nonetheless, I still always write everything first of all by hand,
Oh,
and
really?
I then type it up myself. And it's interesting. A great hero, woman hero writer, a philosopher of mine, Helen Oppenheimer, said to me, computers are the death of good English. So there you are.
Interesting.
Now
I'm really interested that you write by hand, Stephen.
Yes, I still do.
Did you learn to type as a young man? Oh
no, I type very badly, but I use two fingers rather than one. But so it's very slow. But there's something cathartic about writing something in longhand. But there's another question, another good question come, I think, here, which is someone's asked, what were your favourite novels? What were your favourite books to read when you were a child?
Well, of course, one of them, The Secret Garden, and that was one of the main reasons that I got interested in Frances Hodgson Burnett. But apart from her, my favourite novelist, children's book writer, is totally unknown now, totally out of print. But I did talk about her at the Children's Book History Society recently, just last year, the end of last year, when we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Children's Book History Society. And this was Emmy Atkinson. I wonder if any of people watching this Zoom have read Emmy Atkinson. She wrote stories about a family called the Lockets, and they were terribly important to me at the time. I was, as you said, I was in New Zealand as a child. I was away from my parents, and each Christmas and birthday, one of these children's books, one of these novels, would somehow manage to reach me across the sea, 12,000 miles. I don't think any of them ever sunk. Books did, I mean, letters sometimes went astray, but I have them now still. And that's partly probably why they were so important to me, because they were so English and I was in New Zealand. And you see, I've always been an outsider. I'm English now, really, to all intents and purposes, having born in London and lived my life in England. But part of me is still, and the fact that all four of my grandparents were born in New Zealand does make me, in fact, it maddened me when I was at Auckland Airport. I've been to New Zealand many times, and I have to queue up with the list, I don't have a New Zealand passport. My brother has managed to have both. I could have, I think, when I was 21, I could have chosen to have both passports, but I didn't. Anyway, that's Emmy Atkinson's the answer to that question.
And one more question about reading, really, and that is, someone said, do you have a favourite modern biographer alongside yourself?
Well, I have two. One particularly close friend, Hilary Spurling, is a dear friend of mine, and so naturally I've read everything she's written, and I think she's marvelous. But I am a keen reader of biography, and I know Hermione Lee and Victoria Glendinning and Richard Holmes and so on. Now, Richard Holmes has a nice story about him, because it ties up with that story I told about Edmund Goss. When we had our 50th, was it our 50th, our golden wedding? Yes. One of our daughters, Lucy, invited lots of our friends, including Richard Holmes, to write something in a book for us. And Richard told the story of one particular event, dinner that when he came to, and like Edmund Goss, he got everything. I had an account that I'd written in my diary at the time, and everything that Richard said was slightly inaccurate. I had this vivid memory, and indeed it was written in my diary, that of Rose Tremaine, Richard's wife, sitting by the fire with Anthony because they'd refused to walk around the field with the rest of us. And well, anyway, it was all totally different. So this just proves that unless you write something down at the time, it's likely memory is very unreliable. It's a very good thing to remember as a biographer, especially if you meet people who actually knew your subjects, as I have done from time to time, and memory gets twisted and is not reliable unless it's in writing.
Then I think the last literary biography I read fairly recently was about Edward Lear. Now I'm trying to think who wrote the.
Yes, there have been several of Edward Lear, but you're oh yes, who is it?
Very good. Can't think. But what I wanted to say is, Christiane came back to say that the question she asked about burning books and so on, she'd picked up on the net and she couldn't quite believe it. No, and I'm going to draw this to a close now and say, first of all, a huge thank you. One couldn't have a more enthusiastic person to have a conversation with. I'm really grateful also to people across the world who've joined us. I would just ask if they would be kind enough to think about making a donation towards the cost of the Berwick Literary Festival, because these things, take a bit of organising. We'd be hugely grateful for that. And there's a survey which you can respond to if you feel like doing that, comments on social media. And perhaps most important of all is to note the dates for next year's festival, where we hope we might see people in person, from the 14th to the 17th of October, 2021.
Yes. And can I just say one thing? Say I'm so grateful. When I accepted the invitation, of course, I thought I was coming to Berwick, which is, after all, only about an hour's drive from where our daughters lives in Newcastle. But it was so lovely to see those photographs at the beginning. And obviously, I hope that many, more people will visit Berwick. Such a lovely place to be. I can't quite think how you got there. I meant to ask you.
Well, we got here because for a variety of reasons. We've had a house in Northumberland for 30 years. My wife's Northumbrian, and I consider myself, I'm not sure whether Northumbrians would, an adopted Northumbrian. I've been coming for so long. But I'm so glad you said what you said, because I was going to say to people, having looked at those wonderful images at the beginning, if you've never been to Berwick, please come and see us here. It's a most wonderful place. And the Literary Festival has gained more and more momentum too. So come to that. And this has been enormously good fun. And I hope that you'll send our love, by which I mean all those who are listening, to Anthony. I know he's not well. And we just said we'd love to be with him too, but we quite understand. And there we are. I hope you never know, you might still get up here sometime. I hope so.
I hope so. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much.
Bye.